Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So, of course, we are on these laws that God is stating to Noah after he comes off the ark, which means this is basically the relationship that God has with humanity and some very fundamental uh, legislation, if you want to call it that, that God has with humanity. One of those, by the way, we talk about the Noahide laws, and one of them is to establish courts, for adjudication and things like that. But here we're talking about the fact that humanity is given permission to consume meat for the very first time. And there's a limitation in the sense that human beings are not included in this at all, of course, and the prohibition against murder of any kind. We examined that before, and we're going to keep going with this. Okay, so here we go. And I think this is really where we are. Okay, I just want to make sure we did not forgive me because it's so easy for me to forget where we are on this. So, according to what I have here, we are okay. Um, yes, lennafshotechem, according to your souls. Let me take a look at the verse itself here with you. Okay, here it is up here. V'ach, however, this is the limitation in terms of eating meat, right? Of being carnivores. So they are limit. So the ach is but. In other words, establishing a limitation. Ach, however, it dimchem lenafshotechem, your blood according to your souls. In other words, your life blood, your soul's blood, Edrosh, I will search out. I will hold you accountable. Miyad kol chaya edroshenu, from any animal I will account, it'll be held accountable. I will search it out. Umiyad ha'adam, and if it's done by a human being, miyad ish achiv, from a man to his brother, Edrosh et nefesh ha'adam. I will hold accountable, right? I will search out the soul of a human being, meaning essentially that if someone takes the life of a human being, they are going to be held accountable. God will hold them accountable. In other words, and another way of putting it, right, that if in fact we are describing, when we talk about belief in God as having to do with looking at examining one's relationship to the universe, to the very world in which we live, um, that we have committed a very grievous infraction against that relationship. So, going on here now, lennafshotechem edrosh, right? According to your souls, I will search it out, I will require it, I will demand it, etc. Tanya. So we know this word Tanya we've come across many, many times. It means that it's from a source that predates the second century, the year 200, and that it's contemporaneous with the Mishnaic material, but not necessarily included within the Mishnah itself. V'ach etimchem lenafshotechem edrosh, right? However, your blood, in other words, your life, right, according to your souls, I will require. Rabbi Elazar says, Miyad nafshotechem edrosh dimchem. So it's interesting, right? He plays around with the order of the sequence of words in the verse to come up with another way of understanding it. From your life, I will require your blood. Here is what we're saying. Okay, from your life, I will require your blood, or from you, I will require your blood. Now, dimchem, often blood, when, like, for example, when Joseph's brothers talk about how his blood is on their heads, it means taking his life, taking Joseph's life. So in other words, from you I will require your blood, your death. Mikan, and from this, she'ein adam rashai lechabel be'atzmo, and from this we can infer that a person is not permitted to damage, to harm themselves. Right? We already discussed suicide in a previous one. We may be going, in other words, intentionally hurting yourself is not considered permissible. Let's take a look at what Torah T'mimah has to say about this. Let's see here. Kenire, it would appear, mefaresh lenafshotechem, right? He is interpreting to your souls, kamo min nafshotechem, as if it says from your souls, right? Le means to, mi means from, right? That's that introductory, that prefix that is put in front of words, right? Ukamo, and it's similar. Mincha hishlucha le'avdicha le'Yaakov. When Jacob is about to meet up with Esau, he tells the servant to tell Esau, when that servant brings a gift, to use these words, and it means a gift. It is, in other words, what I'm bringing is a gift, shlucha le'avdicha, which is being sent to your servant. And then it says le'Yaakov, which literally would mean to Jacob. Shepirusho, however, it really means me avdacha, from your servant, me Yaakov. In other words, Jacob, of course, is sending the gift to Esau. And we see that the lamed is used instead of a m, instead of a mem. V'chein Lashem HaYeshua. There's a statement that says, to God is the salvation, which really means Me Hashem HaYeshua, which means from God is the salvation. In other words, the to here means that to God we attribute the salvation. So I need you to check to see a little bit of housekeeping here. If you don't have your mute on, I'm hearing some feedback. So somebody does not have their mute on. And if you want to have a question, just raise your hand and I'll be happy to take the question. Pri haklal hayudua. He says there is a general, well-known, established grammatical rule, the otiot hasmuchot ze lazeh, that letters that are right next to each other, and of course a lamed and a mem follow each other, right? Lamed is right before mem, mem is right after lamed. That's what he's talking about when they're smuchim. They're right next to, adjoining one another. Mitchalfot, they can be exchanged. So that's the reason why sometimes where it really means m, it uses la. Uvagamara, and in the Gemara, in the Talmud, parich, there is an objection raised, de yesh lomar, that one could say, de ein mikan ra'aya l'chabala, that this particular verse, and you may have thought of this yourselves, is that this is not necessarily a proof regarding injuring, right? What's it talking about? It's talking about suicide. So does this in fact prove that one isn't allowed to intentionally injure yourself? Kevan, since, and he's now say it, hey, Kevan, since dahacha, because in this particular case, in this verse, bemita ire, it's dealing with death. Vidilma, and perhaps katla shani, that it's making an exception of death. In other words, it's saying you can't take your life, but if you want to injure yourself, that is not necessarily forbidden from this verse, right? Aval, he goes on to say, aval, however, kinireh, it would appear, ein ze ela dichui ba'alma. We can't say that this is really a strong objection. We can say, okay, where dichui literally means pushing aside. And he's saying here that objection, by saying, well, maybe it's just talking about death and not about injury, isn't really a good objection. Why? Upashtut ha'inyan kolel gam chabala aguf. Because if you're looking at the whole context of what's being said here, it's clear that the subject here is talking in general of injuring one's body, and death is one aspect. It's just one specific example of how one can injure oneself. And here it's talking about essentially injury, right? Ukemosha katav bebaba metzia, and it's stated in the tractate Baba Metzia, in the Talmud, this is page 95a, the side, Mali katla kula, Mali katla palga. What difference does it make? What's the difference between major killing? Liktol means to kill, and it means an entire killing, and the difference between us that killing on the complete killing and killing on a halfway. In other words, the idea that when you injure yourself, it is towards the process of destroying yourself. You are, after all, destroying yourself when you injure yourself. So he's saying, if we're talking about death, what difference does it make whether we're talking about a complete death or we're talking about a partial death? So that's the response to this objection. There really isn't any difference. For al kol panim, and in any event, mevuar mikan, becomes clear from this isur mita atzmit, right? And we see mita atzmit means, of course, suicide, right? We learn from this the idea that if you can't injure yourself partially, then obviously you can't commit suicide. It comes out clearly. Utmihani, and he says, I am surprised, she'amlu ha'acharonim, that the acharonim are the latter, literally it means the later sages. An acharon is an authority that follows the publication of the Shulchan Aruch, right? So, in other words, up from the time of the completion of the Talmud to the publication of the Shulchan Aruch. These are known as Rishonim, essentially, right? They're talking about the former sages, and after the Shulchan Aruch was compiled, all sages that follow, authorities that follow, are called Acharonim. There are practical legal ramifications to these distinctions. One in general is that there's this overall sense that the further away we are from the original giving of the Torah at Sinai, the less authority we have. So on the one hand, it works like that in the sense that an acharon cannot contradict, specifically a rishon. If a Rishon lays down a rule, right, an Acharon cannot simply say that rule doesn't work. They would have to find another Rishon who had contradicted that particular Rishon A's rule. But they may be able to modify in some way or show circumstances, but they can't change the rule. However, on the opposite side, the more recent the decision and the arbitration regarding a rule, the more authority it has. So in terms of on a practical kind of level. So he's saying that these later authorities were struggling, limtzor makor, to find a root, right? Lema amar, lahama amar, hamaforsam, right? The famous statement, there's a famous statement, this is a well-known statement, Hama'abed atzmo lada'at, there's the one who commits suicide, ein lo chelek le'olam haba, has no portion in the world to come. So essentially, committing suicide is a very serious, from a traditional Jewish perspective, there is that idea that committing suicide is basically something that has very, very serious consequences in terms of one's immortality. Of course, there are always circumstances where it might be permissible, but as a general rule, we are absolutely against suicide without going into details over that law. But that's a well-known law. And so the Acharonim were trying to find a good, reliable source for this. V'lo heviu kol semach mikan. And they don't come to this verse, this one that we're analyzing right now. They didn't look to this verse that we're discussing right now. V'halo kan, but the truth is that right here in this verse or in this interpretation, right, that we were citing, right, that's Rabbi Elazar's statement. Remez nichbad la'inyan zeh. We see a really good, reliable support for that particular idea. We're saying we have a biblical verse that forbids suicide because we also believe it forbids injuring oneself. Daha hemshech kavanat hapasuk, because if we go and we follow the intention of this verse, hu dechamod dehahoreg et chavero. In the previous verse, we were talking about someone who kills and murders someone else, right? Horgin oto be'olam hazeh. They say that is a capital offense even in this world. In other words, someone who kills a fellow who commits murder, that's considered a capital offense, and their life would be taken, they would have to be executed. So if that's the case for taking another person's life, that's why it would make sense, kach hahoreg et atzmo, one who kills himself, horgin oto b'olam haba. Well, consequently, since he has committed self-murder, there is a punishment that goes on, an accountability for that, and for that reason, he is, as it were, killed, quote, quote, in the next world. Umahi hahariga ba'olam haba. But what can you say is really what constitutes, capital punishment in the next world? Halo pashut, it's pretty obvious who she ma'abdin nafsho v'chalko l'olam haba, that one destroys that person's soul and his portion in the world to come, v'dok, and that means, of course, QED. So he is saying that basically that is a proof that suicide has that statement that says a person who commits suicide has no portion in the world to come is actually supported by this particular verse and how we understand it and how the Gemara understands it. So I'm going to mark this place here, and so we know where we are next time. And put that right there. So I didn't know if you'd want to comment on this, if any of you have any thoughts. There's some pretty tough stuff we just were discussing. So if any of you have a question or a comment or an objection, please hold forth.
There's certain types of suicide. I mean, it's mental. It's mental, and it could be stopped by if you see your person
right
doing different things, and you should take him to a psychiatrist so you can stop this suicide.
Right.
But he might just do it.
I think, Harlan, I'm glad you're raising that. So in general, you know that when there's a suicide, the person is buried on the side of the cemetery. There's a special place where suicides are buried. In general, as to the degree that I've studied this subject, it seems to me that we go to every extent we can to not look at it as suicide in the sense of a person in a cool and calm manner or in a cold-hearted kind of way decided to take their own lives. That we say that there were circumstances where one can't really define this as suicide, and we define suicide very narrowly, and that's how we deal on a practical level with this. So you'd have to, in other words, in order to claim that it's a suicide, you have to show that the person had no reason at all to do this per se, other than the desire to take their own life.
I was thinking about Stuart Showcraft. His son
Yes,
took his life. Now, there's no reason because they were good people.
absolutely.
And, I couldn't figure out why his son did that.
Right, right. No, I know. I'm sorry we're mentioning names, but yes, there was a case. Clearly, in that case, we're talking about somebody who was suffering from a very, very deep depression. Right, right. You're right. And in that particular case, we would not consider it this situation of suicide. So I think the point you're raising, Harlan, is really important. That knowing what we mean and being able to define clearly what we mean by suicide as we discuss this law in this situation, and to realize that in terms of actual application, it's a very narrow definition.
I have a friend who's was declining some pretty rapidly from Parkinson's,
Right.
and chose the date of death.
Yes.
And how do you address that?
Right. And there was a person I was visiting while I was up in Santa Rosa who also decided to basically starve themselves and not feed themselves. Fortunately, I'm not the judge in these situations. It's, when it came to that person's funeral, I gave them all the honors that one normally would get in a funeral. Um, this person wasn't doing it because they were mentally deranged. They were doing it because they had lived a full life and were in a great deal of pain. They were suffering greatly, greatly. So again, I would not judge that person harshly for that decision. Having said that, I think that we, in some ways, I think if I can mention sort of a different case, there was a case of an exhibit of a person who actually took bodies of criminals and took their bodies and put them on display, put chemicals in them. This exhibit went through St. Louis, I remember. Quite possibly it was up in the Bay Area as well. And the idea was that these were real people. These were real people that were now on display, etc. My problem with that is it makes an assumption that somehow we have ownership of some kind over people's bodies. And a Jewish position would be is we really don't own ourselves. We don't, because we can ask the question, by what right? I mean, when you want to claim ownership, you have to have some rational basis as to why you can claim ownership. So, for example, in terms of an idea, if you came up with an idea that no one else came up with, you have a right for copyright because you own that idea. But we did not create ourselves. We did not create the processes by which our bodies and our intelligence, etc. So a very fundamental place is to not see ourselves as having complete ownership over our bodies. And of course, that's simply not a consideration in what I would say is modern Western society. We simply assume we own ourselves.
I think that God is ownership of our
Obviously,
body.
right. God is the author of our right. As a believer, for sure, we believe that God is, to put it sort of poetically, God is the author of our bodies and our lives. And so that we have to do things to this extent that we actually have control, and we do obviously have a good deal of control, or more or less, depending on the individual. We have to be respectful. So I
Why
felt,
is
yeah.
violating copyright?
Say that again. I'm sorry, Judith. I didn't catch what you said.
We're committing copyright violation.
Yes, we are. Well said. Thank you. Thanks for going with that one. Yes, David, please.
Yeah. So I guess the way that I'm understanding all this, really, it's down to, the circumstances you've always pointed out all through the cases. So, going through this in terms of what constitutes suicide in this narrow aspect really is that, we have a guideline around, it's really like killing yourself with no other reason.
Correct.
But in the end, when you look at a person and if they, take this action, it's really going to be God that judges that. It's not the rest
Absolutely.
of us. So
Absolutely.
there's so saying, yeah. So that's the part that, so when we say that we don't condone suicide, we don't condone it in this very narrow definition that you just described and everything, but there, and then everything else that people term as suicide is really up to God to decide, does it fit in this narrow definition or not, right?
Right.
And I mean that's how I'm looking at it. Is
Right.
that a reasonable? Okay.
No, I think that's good. The only thing I would add is that in all cases, God ultimately is the judge,
Right, of
because we
course.
are talking about the life and the world to come. We have no
Right.
jurisdiction whatsoever, as the Torah T'mimah pointed out to us, over, over that particular decision.
But it's not
Yeah,
right. And the point I'm trying to make is, like you
yeah,
said earlier, it's not us as individuals that are judging whether or not a person, quote
correct.
unquote, committed suicide in the narrow definition that we really forbid, right? I mean, and
Right.
that's
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 correct. That is,
that's
yeah,
that's the hard part, which
right.
to me says we really shouldn't have to put these people shouldn't go on a special place in the cemetery. They almost, because we shouldn't, again, if you do that, then basically you're judging them and saying that they fell into this category if they were going on, in a particular, well, anyway. So yeah, it seems a little contradictory. So,
Right.
but
Judith?
It's my
yeah,
hand.
thanks.
Okay.
I raised my.
Okay. Yeah, Judith, I'll let Goldie go. Thanks,
Sure.
Deb. Go ahead, Goldie. You're muted now, so
Oh, sorry. I thought I was on. Oh, he
yeah,
said I.
go ahead.
Sorry, I thought I was on mute when I said
No,
that. I
no.
apologize. Um,
Go ahead.
I was just wondering, if all rabbis would bury, like, I know this is a hard question, but if somebody dies by suicide, then do all rabbis abide by that and bury them on the side, or there's exceptions because, like, let's say, like, it was usually it's due to, especially if somebody's young and they do it, it's usually due to a mental health, disorder. So, like, would they like, I mean, like, I wonder if I wonder if everybody is buried on the side, or they try to
So,
just,
so Goldie, I can tell you very clearly that different rabbis have different opinions. And sometimes it has to do with the movement they belong to and what sect they belong to. So it really depends on the individual rabbi and how they make all their decisions in terms of these kinds of things. So in terms of your question itself is it just varies according to the rabbi you were speaking to. So, Judith?
Well, what gets me is that this is Passover,
Mm-hmm.
and the wicked son. And I've struggled with that wicked son issue for
Oh, yeah.
years,
Yes.
probably most often by skipping it.
Can
But,
I call you chicken?
yeah, I would say.
Go
Let's
on.
put it this way: no one of you has ever said to me, "Hey, you left out the 4 children."
Yes.
But I do have a version of to the Song of Clementine, but the
Yeah. I'm familiar. Yes.
okay, so the that child says, "What does this have to do with me?" Separating self out from the
Right.
community,
Yes.
and that, in some sense, that taking on I don't know, control of when do I die, is separating yourself out from the community.
Yes. I could probably see the logic of that. You should know, of course, that it says in the Haggadah, in the traditional words of the Haggadah, that by separating himself from the community, he denies an essential principle. That essential principle, to put it quite mildly, because they don't want to say it, means denying the existence of God. they don't want to say it. They say it euphemistically because it's considered such a terrible thing to say. Of course, people do it quite openly these days. They're not, and a lot of people obviously question God's existence. It happens. So that's the sense of separating oneself from the community. Um, I was trying to think. There was sort of some other point that I felt went along with this. Okay. Some of these things we read are very harsh, right? I mean, we read something that was pretty harsh today. And yet at the same time, I think there is the value that I see, despite its harshness, is to waken us up, right, to the fact that things that we may take for granted or not consider very important, even though we don't think they're important, may in fact be very important. And it's not so much the idea that we want to bury people along the side, suicides along the side of the cemetery, but what it is trying to communicate is that these things have grave consequences. And frankly, I think in some ways, the times that we are living in now, which are so disconcerting to many people for a lot of variety, and where people themselves are being treated in terrible, terrible kinds of ways, are a result of something that's a process of how you think about your life. So, of course, I have an axe to grind because I'm a rabbi, but I feel that thinking deeply about what religion has to teach us has far graver consequences than most people are willing to admit on the surface. And that these things that we're reading right now isn't so much because we want to do this thing to people or that we want to, practice capital punishment. But the reason these things are in the Torah is to tell us that we need to think about these things seriously. And that in fact, if we ignore these things, there will be serious consequences. So that was sort of the thought that I had, because people don't take belief in God seriously, but belief in God has a lot of implications to it. Okay. I mean, as I said, I like to put it in a way which I trust people can relate to better, which is what's your relationship to the universe? You are part of a universe. You are existing within a universe. What is that relationship? And when you see it in the kind of ways that I believe our tradition, for one, I think there are others that do this as well, that try to teach us how to act ethically and morally and compassionately, etc. It's all talking about our relationship to this universe and how we need to behave. And in some ways, people who follow criminal behavior, okay, are unfortunately foolish. They're only kidding themselves, partially because I believe no matter what, how much money you make doing it, etc., ultimately it is of little satisfaction, and for such a brief time at that, because we're here for such a short time. So you've got my Pesach sermon for this weekend, and I'm glad you gave me the opportunity perhaps to look at how harsh some of these things are that we talked about today. So I'm still open to any other comments if you want to make them. Otherwise, we'll go off the record. Okay. Yeah, Goldie, you wanted to say something? Just come. Yeah.
I just wanted to say it was really nice being on here, and I'm sorry about before because I thought I was on mute when I said, "Oh, can I raise my hand?" And also, I was a little embarrassed. I thought I was on mute when I said,
No, it's not a big deal. Not a big deal, honestly.
And also, it's a very sad topic, and I guess it's important. It's interesting. I didn't know they talked about this in the Torah. Is this in the Chumash? I don't
Okay.
know what you guys are up to.
We're reading a commentary by Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein, and he wrote this commentary, I would say, somewhere in the 19th century, mid-late 19th century is my guess. And what he does is he takes his knowledge of material that is in the Talmud, whether it's the Jerusalem Talmud, sometimes it's from Midrashim, it's from rabbinic sources, and he sets them out in a way that's easier to understand. He doesn't quote, but he reworks the wording so it's a little easier to understand. So if it's in Aramaic, he translates it into Hebrew, things like that. And then the part that we are reading underneath in the Rashi script is his commentary on that source and his musings about the source and its significance. Sometimes it's explaining it. In this particular case, he was saying that there was something curious in the fact that other scholars did not use this source to support what they were believing, what they were stating, etc. So it's called Torah T'mimah. But it's not in the Chumash as such. But it is material that our sages of blessed memory, the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud, that early time period where rabbinic thinking was getting its major expression, that's the basis of this commentary. So it's their thoughts and their comments about this. Okay.
Thank you.
Let me go off record, okay?